All right, welcome back to Newsgang, and we are still on the State of the Nation address. And Linus, you were finishing up something about the president's speech, and with regard to the sort of seriousness or lack of it, that it accorded to this very important global issue right now. I mean, and one would expect that this is a preoccupation of any government anywhere today, that people want to know what is going to happen tomorrow. There are very many things that have happened. There's that gaffe about the vaccine that has come from the CS. There is the whole thing of NHIF. There is just so much confusion that doesn't give a lot of comfort to people who are actually dealing with this pandemic as we speak. People being affected in the various ways.
On COVID, Joe, I may sound like I'm pushing for criminal culpability on the part of the writers of this speech, because, by the way, and if you look at it, you read it, the second para, when it opens, is the president explains where he's been and says, "I return to this esteemed chamber to deliver my 7th State of the Nation address in a house that I had the privilege of serving in for 11 years, 5 years on the opposition benches as leader of official opposition, and for 6 years as a cabinet minister. My mixed bag of fortunes whilst in this house affirms the possibilities of our nation." This may well be true, but is it appropriate on the day? This day ought to have been about explaining how the COVID pandemic has basically disrupted livelihoods in this country. I want to go very quickly, Joe, to the bit where the president gets to talk about our frontline workers. And the speechwriter says, I want to try and just place this on the speechwriter's side, we also recognize, the keyword there is also, we also recognize and honor all our first responders, frontline staff, and essential workers who have selflessly gone above and beyond the call of duty and ensured the Kenyan flame continued to burn bright. We're talking about medical personnel that are dying because of putting their lives in the front line in the fight against the pandemic. They also do have names. State of the Nation speeches, like I said earlier, Joe, ought to be about specifics. They must touch the hearts of the people. They must sound accountable. The generalities that went into today's State of the Nation address, as far as the question of COVID-19 is concerned, honestly, Joe, it's nearly criminal.
For me, I think also, I thought he would address the issue of corruption, particularly with regarding COVID monies and what we have seen in KEMSA, because that scandal, which is still under investigation, as we all know, derailed the messaging of government, eroded public trust, distorted the government messaging to the extent that many members of the public started to doubt the numbers that were being put forward, in light of the scandal that took place. It horrified people. I thought he would have spent some time to tell us about, or reiterate his commitment, at least to the fight against corruption, particularly to do with COVID. I thought he would also have spent a little bit of time reassuring Kenyans as to who's going to pay for the costs of treatment. Now we are hearing NHIF saying you're on your own. If you will remember, earlier on in March this year, it was the CAS, Dr. Rashid Aman, who had talked about, at the time, remember, there was the mandatory isolation when people were coming in from the country, and he had specifically said that the country will pay for the costs of treatment and the costs of testing. And because those costs were so prohibitive, isolation at the time, yes. And because the costs of things like testing were so prohibitive, many people were not even coming out to declare it because they were not going to be able to afford the costs. And then today we hear something different. Also, when it comes to the medical workers, who's going to cushion them? We've heard from the Medical Dentists and Practitioners Union about, whether they have insurance, about how the fact that medical practitioners are paying for their own bills when they contract COVID within the line of duty. So it would have been interesting to hear him say something about that. Finally, the other thing I thought he would have said about COVID is something more forward-looking. He spent quite a bit of time telling us about those economic measures that we all know about, reduction of pay, corporate tax, and that sort of thing. But considering we're in a second wave, much like other countries across the world that are now going into tighter restrictions ahead of Christmas, well, we do know what he said in his address the other day, but what more is he doing, considering October and November have been particularly tougher months for COVID, in the country? So just some maybe long-term, mid-term plans as to this is what we're thinking about. These are sort of some of the strategies we're putting in place. Instead, for me, it was heavy on the history of what he's done, but very, very thin on where we're going, on forward-looking, including, yes, yeah. Right.
Wow. Can we go across the oceans and talk a little bit about what's happening out there in the US of A, United States of America? They just had their election, which is over, but it's not over.
It's not over.
Yeah, we can actually listen to Joe Biden, who is the president-elect, according to the projections of many news networks over there. That election, obviously, that result being contested by the incumbent Donald Trump. Joe Biden talking about Americans not being enemies, everyone being an American.
Treated our opponents as our enemies. They are not our enemies. They are Americans. They're Americans. The Bible tells us, to everything there is a season, a time to build, a time to reap and a time to sow, and a time to heal. This is the time to heal in America. Our work begins with getting COVID under control. We cannot repair the economy, restore our vitality, or relish life's most precious moments, hugging our grandchildren, our children, our birthdays, weddings, graduations, all the moments that matter most to us, until we get it under control.
So Linus, you followed the U.S. elections over the years. Usually this kind of speech would have been preceded by a certain phone call. In fact, most speeches of this nature usually start like a few moments ago, I received a call from so-and-so, and then they would go on and praise their opponent and then proceed to say what they wanted to say. This is not happening. Joe Biden is speaking in a very different pace from what typically president-elects would be speaking in.
It is a very unusual time in the United States of America, because what we are seeing is a departure from their norms, a departure from their cultures. Transition of political power has normally been a very, very smooth and straightforward process, which begins with that moment a candidate crosses the 270 electoral college vote. Joe Biden did cross this quite early in the week, but Trump has refused to recognize that, he's refused to acknowledge that, and he has set out a number of legal challenges in a number of states. Pennsylvania, he's also doing Georgia, Michigan, Arizona and Wisconsin. He's trying, this is a fishing expedition of the kind America has never witnessed, because we do not know, and I've tried digging up to see where any election where a candidate goes past the 270 mark has been reversed. I've seen some of his supporters arguing that there was 2,000. 2,000 had not crossed 270. And 2,000 was about a very, very tight margin of about 537 votes in Georgia. It was he who carries Georgia. Sorry, in Florida. Yeah. He who carries Florida becomes president. So this is not 2,000.
It is not. Yeah. But what is interesting is, for me, the fact that regardless of whatever happens, over 7 million people voted for Trump. And that says something about the Americans.
70.
Sorry, over 70 million, that's right. Because I think in total it's more than 150 million.
Now.
Yes. And Biden leading with a little over 5 million votes, between them. over 70 million people voted for Trump, and that says something. Even if you get to the end and Vice President-elect Joe Biden becomes the president, he's taking over a deeply divided country. I mean, he's already talking about issuing a mandatory mask order in a country that has, half of the people that voted, not believing in that. And whatever it is they say, Trump gave a voice to quite a few people who are now feeling like they're the minority. I remember watching a documentary by US journalist Soledad O'Brien. We've talked about this before. That talks about the changing demographics of the United States, with many immigrants of different races coming in, and where you have the white population increasingly feeling marginalized. And the height of that, of course, was the election of Obama, not once, not twice. And some say that's how we got to Trump. And now with him there and with where we are in their country right now, I think it's going to be a tough road ahead, and America has to face up to its demons. And here's another interesting thing. They kept, and perhaps also we did, calling it an American or African election. It is not. Let America deal with their demons. This is what it is. He is not like an African dictator. If you want to call him that, he's an American autocrat. Let's put it squarely where it is and have Americans have to deal with their issues and face that. And I think for me, that'll be the interesting thing going forward. And the fact that there are great expectations on a Biden presidency, many of which I'm afraid he may not meet in the first 4 years, should he, be inaugurated next year.
I think for me, I think as someone who's observed the US over the years, I think what is very sad about this is what it does to some of the values that people have espoused around the world, values of democracy, rule of law, and all of these things. There's a certain leadership role that the US has been known for. For instance, when you talk about the UN, its backbone has been the US. When you talk about, for example, global environmentalism, as a student of environmentalism, I know that the US, for example, in the early 70s, pushed very hard. In fact, even UNEP, which is now called UN Environment, its very formation was actually as a result of the movements that had happened in the US. And in fact, the draft resolution that founded UNEP was actually done by an American, the person who led the US delegation to the meeting in Stockholm. So even in multilateralism in general has really been, in a sense, underwritten a lot by the US. And so you have Donald Trump coming on the stage, and this flies out of the window. So he withdraws out of WHO, the Paris Climate Agreement, which is a big deal, the Iran nuclear deal, and all of these things. NAFTA, in a sense, just saying, you know what, we can do what we want when we want. And so you have a situation where right now they've done an election and we are again witnessing something we are not used to. So I think that the US has a lot of work to do in terms of gaining global leadership, in terms of all these various things that they have led the world in, whether it is peace and security, whether it's democracy, all these values that are seen as really immutable. But right now, you can actually argue with what democracy really means. But
credit to Trump, Joe, to the point you're making about multilateralism. He made it very clear from the beginning, America first. He said that. That was his mantra. And what it meant is we are giving our back to everybody else except Americans. And he did that. Now, his base is very happy. When you look at 70 million votes, it's because his base is very, very happy. What is he delivered? He is delivered on immigration. Just shut those doors. Don't let everyone stream into America like they used to. 2, trade and tariffs. He's fought China. And fought Canada, fought the European Union. Number 3, of course, he has also basically said, we are going to share the bill when it comes to NATO and our troops serving outside the country. This resonated very well with the Republican base, but there are a lot of negatives that came with it, because the Republican base and the Trump base started having a racist definition. is the purity of the white skin. It started crossing the line. It's no longer about the ideology. It actually became the color of the skin.
That actually America First was seen as a code word
for white
first. And I think that is really the problem that we are dealing with right now.
Yeah, and just to epitomize, Joe, what you were talking about, the standing in the world of America, I don't know if you saw a tweet by the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, regarding the Tanzanian elections. And it, called out the irregularities that he said had been witnessed, and the responses were swift. Many people saying, oh, we thought you were talking about your own election. And then there was the other lady as well, I forget her name, but, people are now telling them, look, you've got to sort out your own issues. And I think maybe for me, the silver lining with that is, even if we're sort of lambasting the US and maybe having a bit of a good laugh with it, is that we now have to confront what our own measure of democracy is, not benchmarked against the US. And now many countries will be forced to decide for themselves, what are our standards of good governance? What are our standards of democracy? Simply because, the US isn't that example anymore. And maybe that is something good going forward, that we start to define for ourselves, what that is, rather than, basing it, on the United States, even as they Joe, grapple with their own problems.
As you take calls from Francis, Jamila, myself, your namesake took a very important call this evening from the Pope Francis.
Oh, did he?
Congratulating him for his poll victory.
Oh.
There's something that he's also doing. It is legitimacy. He's already getting very important calls from allies, from foreign leaders, which is normally quite a good measure. And
to think that is happening actually at a time when there is a standoff, and a lot of I actually was listening to some of the media outlets in the US, and they're saying that there's actually a problem. The State Department is not putting through a lot of those calls.
Yes.
So there's a sense in which they're actually even using some back routes, if you like, to actually talk to this.
I believe he still keeps his mobile.
I know. Like,
well, it's not switched off like the Nigerian
No, his numbers
calls
are still on, and so he's using previous contacts from when he was VP and all of those things.
Right.
Quite interesting, actually.
Yeah. Okay. So we have Kashuri.
Francis, I think we have spoken a lot, and the floor is yours now.
Interesting that the floor is mine, but I would want to say one thing about what I've observed about the American elections. I think democracy is a journey, and much as America is an old democracy, I still see them with the challenges that we still have around here. Challenges of closely contested election, challenges of acceptance of electoral results, challenges of questions around the process of an election. And much as every so often we beat ourselves too much as a country, still making steps, and probably if we keep it in terms of making the right steps, we will be up there with the big boys in terms of democracy. But it's a lesson for all of us that democracy is a journey. And I hoped, and I still hope, that as we continue with the BBI process, we will also address the fundamental issues about our electoral process, how we conduct our elections, what ails our elections in terms of the people managing that election, the process of voting, counting, and transmitting the results, so that ultimately the winners and the losers will say this was a fair exercise. I think this is a challenge that we must learn as a country, and try to better our systems in terms of an election, so that ultimately we end up with the right leaders in place, and in a process that even those who lose will say there was something that resembles a free, fair, credible, and transparent exercise.
All right, thank you very much, Francis. Lots of lessons to learn from out there, and see how those ones apply here. I think this is a good point at which to take this home, as Jamila would say, and tonight we're going to start with Yvonne.